Hello and welcome to another HCI 509 Research Methods and Statistical Analysis lecture. In this lecture, we'll talk about ethics in HCI research. One of the big objectives here is protecting participants. So scientific experts are researchers. We have expertise, experience, and contextual knowledge about the experiment. We know kind of the limits of what it will do and the potential gains from what we uncover during the experiment process. We're well equipped to understand the reasons for conducting the experiment, and we know kind of the trade-off between the costs and the benefits involved with the study. Now, contrast that with a potential participant. They may not know all of this relevant information. They don't understand the study except for what they're told. So studies with human participants, really what they do is they put researchers in a privileged position. So researchers have more knowledge about what will happen in the study, what the potential outcomes are than participants. There's got to be some kind of protections that can help participants not be exploited. So research studies should be designed to protect them. We have something called informed consent. This provides participants with the information necessary to make meaningful decisions as to whether or not they'll participate. This informed consent is something where perhaps there's a disclosure about what the study's about and how, if they suffer any kinds of adverse consequences, they can report this to the research supervisor. So this is kind of a cornerstone of the protection of participants. What happens is we as researchers, have to have what we call an institutional review board, often abbreviated as IRB. What this does is this reviews the proposed research design, and it requires for researchers to identify any possible risks and guarantee that appropriate procedures of informed consent are being followed. Now, there's certain kinds of studies where these can be waived, but they have to be very carefully studied. This is really about minimizing risk and making sure that any concerns about the study are addressed appropriately. So typically what happens is the participants are given a statement or given a questionnaire or given some kind of way in which they can agree that they will participate and they understand perhaps the consequences of participation. So they will do the tasks, and the experimenter will give some kind of incentive or compensation to the participant. Sometimes this could be direct financial compensation. Sometimes this could be extra credit on an assignment if it's in an academic setting. Sometimes it could be a chance to win an iPod or something where they have an opportunity to get a prize as opposed to a direct prize themselves. Sometimes it could be information or knowledge about the outcome of the study. What happens is the experimenters agreed to conduct what we call responsible research, which will protect participants' rights, their health, their privacy, and their safety. So some of the risks are found in medical research, where we have new drugs or new devices or new procedures, where health risks could certainly be an outcome. This is when perhaps we have things that don't work as intended. We have to be sure that we have mitigated those risks the best possible. So physical harm is not necessarily the only relevant concern. There are a number of famous psychological experiments that shows how people are put in an uncomfortable situation, and this could cause significant emotional distress. Typically in HCI, there's not a whole lot of risk. Most are low-risk studies, which could involve fatigue, so you have repetitive motion or movements. Another one could involve eye strain because they're trying to concentrate or they're trying to do some kind of task that involves a lot of concentration. So regardless of this, researchers have to maintain dignity and respect for the participants. Let's talk about a couple of experiments here. The first is the Milgram experiment. So what happened is this is a deception study. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, I've conducted a couple of deception studies, and IRBs are very rigorous on deception studies. One of them that I had a test to see whether somebody would break into an email account given a password and write an email, for example, from a person to their ex-girlfriend. And because this was deception, we were trying to get participants to actually do something that was morally wrong. When I went and had my IRB study done and proposed it, it had to go to a full board. So it was almost like a trial. And the trial involved a lot of people who were experts because we had a medical school. And medical school is very risk averse in terms of any kind of study that could put the university at risk. Deception studies sometimes are necessary, but in most cases, the deception has to be something that's justifiable. We'll see more about that in a minute. Back to the Milgram experiment. The Milgram experiment is one where subjects were told they were participating in a study on the effect of punishment on learning. So what they did is they were asked to administer tests to another subject, which was called the learner. They had to administer an electric shock if the learner was gave an incorrect answer. And the voltage of the shock would increase every time. So every time that particular learner didn't do or get a correct answer, the voltage on the shock would go up each time. So the shocks were described to these participants as extremely painful. So it couldn't cause permanent damage, but it would definitely cause some temporary discomfort. So the deception part was, it really was just checking to see whether people would obey the rules. So again, the design had participants conducting some kind of electric shock on other people, and the test was to see whether participants would actually follow these types of rules. So no real shocks were given, and the learner was just a ruse. In other words, they were part of the experiment, and they were not somebody who was actually getting shocked. So what happened was the experimenter participated in the deception, urging subjects to continue with the experiment even when they were kind of doubtful about administering the shock. So the deception created a scenario in which obedience had a real cost. Provide a shock to the learner would provide some kind of distress because they're inflicting some harm on some other human. So what happened is they had 40 participants, and all 40 continued giving electric shocks until the point where the learner kicked on the wall and stopped responding to the test questions. So you can imagine what this was like to the participants who were given the shock. What would you think would happen? Do you think that this actually would make people not want to give the maximum shock or not? Well, most of them actually administered the maximum level of shock, 2 steps beyond the danger severe shock. So most actually were very obedient. The participation caused discomfort, including nervous laughter, embarrassment, and seizures for several subjects. Now that sounds very severe. The Milgram experiment would not be considered appropriate in today's research environment. How could this be done responsibly? And one thing was the psychological distress involved with these experiments, actually providing shock to some other human that's suffering. The reactions experienced by some of the participants, in other words, some of them had seizures. Another one is the Stanford Prison Experiment. So this one is pretty famous. It happened back in 1971, and it was conducted at Stanford University. So we wanted to look at the social forces involved with prisons. So a bunch of Stanford undergraduates, all men, were divided into guards and prisoners. The prisoners were arrested at their homes, blindfolded, placed in uniforms, and basically put into a prison. The guards were not given training. They were just simply told what to do to maintain order among the prisoners. So the guards humiliated prisoners, woke them up through the night for counts, placed people in solitary confinement when they felt their authority was challenged. The prisoners, on the other hand, lost their personal identity, thinking of themselves only by their prison ID number. They were passive, depressed, and actually became or felt very helpless. One prisoner suffered significant stress, including crying and rage. So this is pretty significant. And the experiment was originally planned for 2 weeks, but they terminated after 6 days just because of the fact that it got out of control. The impact is interesting because the potential for harm, it was actually approved by the IRB at Stanford University. The participants signed an informed consent form. They knew they were participating in this. And a 73 review determined that the study had been consistent with existing ethical guidelines. So at the time, everything seemed fine, but this actually caused a lot of harm. And this study is well known in IRB training as one that shows the impact of how studies can go out of hand even though that they're approved. So let's take a look at some history of other studies that have shown the need for an IRB. So the first one is Nuremberg Code. So this set a set of ethics principles for research on humans. And this was the result of the Nuremberg trials at the end of the Second World War. If you remember that, they had arrested a bunch of Nazis that were involved with the concentration camps, and they put them on trial. This was a result of how Nazi Germany used the concentration camp prisoners in some rather bizarre medical experiments. You can read about them in lots of different historical journals. Some of them are absolutely horrible to read about, but Nazi Germany used these experiments on prisoners who had no right to say, I don't want to be involved. So there were some principles behind informed consent, which clearly didn't happen in these Nazi experiments. Another one is the Tuskegee syphilis study. Now, in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service, so the government, the federal government, was working with Tuskegee Institute, which is down in Alabama, to record the natural history of syphilis. It involved 600 black men, 399 had syphilis, and 201 did not. And then later, penicillin was determined to be an effective treatment for syphilis and was ubiquitous, but the participants in the study, 399 of them, were with syphilis, but they were not offered treatment on how to eradicate this awful disease. So in 1972, 40 years later, the Associated Press had a news story about this particular study. So what happened is they had somebody review it, and they concluded that the study was ethically unjustified. And what happened was the results were almost inconsequential compared to the risks of the human subjects. What happened is they developed a health benefit program to provide medical care for the survivor. A lot of people think that the Tuskegee syphilis study, they actually gave the participants syphilis, but what they did is they dissuaded them from getting any kind of treatment for the syphilis. Many people suffered when, if they weren't part of the study, they could go to a physician and get treatment. But because of the study, they were unable to do so. So the Belmont report came out in 79. So 7 years after this report from the Tuskegee Institute. And what they found was they established three principles for the treatment of research participants. The first is respect for people. So they want the people to be able to make independent and autonomous decisions regarding their participation. No gathering people from prison because they don't have a choice. So people have to be able to opt out of the study at any point, including while they're involved in the study. Beneficence, which is you're trying to minimize or mitigate the harm while maximizing the possible benefits. Again, this is very subjective. And the third one is justice. So the burdens of participating in the research or the benefits should be limited to certain populations. You'll find when you get more involved with the IRB training, some of the questions they ask is, does the study involve people with disabilities? Does the study involve prisoners? Does the study involve pregnant women? Does the study involve children? Because all of these are participants that may need special protections. So I hope this lecture has been helpful for you to understand the ethical dimensions of doing research studies that involve human subjects. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.